Hi everybody, welcome to week 4. And all I assigned you this week in terms of reading were some readings from the box text. And that seems simple enough, but it's just packed with a lot of information. So in this lecture, I want to supplement those readings with some other information. And really, when you get to the back of this particular lecture, the very last slide, which I'll make sure to show for a few minutes, is the references that I use, and they're very useful references for the most part if you want to review them. I do also reference the box text, but there's additional references that aren't part of your readings. So please look at those if you have questions. So this week we're talking about origins, and we've talked about some of the classics of public administration already, and you remember that Wilson said that it was harder to run a constitution than to write one. So what was he talking about? And I think it's important that we go back to these origins of American democracy, namely the Constitution and the Federalist Papers. Two sets of documents, really, the Constitution itself and the Federalist Papers, that get referred to an awful lot. But what are we really talking about? Well, really, in my view, and Box points this out as well, what we're really talking about is tensions. So in any governmental system, there are always tensions. Even if you have a dictatorship, there will be tensions resident in that form of government. But especially in a democracy, there are tensions always at play. So some of the tensions of American democracy, as Box points out, this idea of classical republicanism versus classical liberalism. Classical republicanism stresses society over the individual, with this participation by virtuous and involved citizens in the institutions of governance. And that's kind of the Greek city-state idea. But it really begs the question of who are the citizens? In other words, even in Athens, the majority of people who lived in Athens were not considered citizens. But citizens were directly involved in governance. And then there's this idea of classical liberalism, which favors individual autonomy. And we find that even in the Declaration of Independence, the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the counter to that is, but at what cost to the dispossessed? Can everyone truly seek life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And then there's tension between procedural democracy versus substantive democracy. And procedural democracy, as Box mentions, is equal rights to participate, or equality of opportunity. But he contrasts that with substantive democracy, and the question there is, to what extent does our democracy, or any democracy, allow inequalities of wealth, power, and privilege? And then there's this tension between representative democracy versus direct democracy. And we are familiar with representative democracy at all levels of our government, right? Where we elect representatives, we elect officials to represent us, either that could be a school board member, or it could be a member of the House of Representatives, a senator. So we elect people to represent us in our democracy versus a direct democracy. And the classic American example of this is the New England town meeting, where every person in the town shows up for the town meeting and has really a direct vote and a direct voice in governance. And so there are all these tensions. And this is what making the Constitution really applied to, some of these tensions. But then we have other tensions, and Box points out the vertical tension and the horizontal tension in government itself. Now, this is post-Constitution, where we came up with a 3-branch government. We all know we have a national government, state governments, and local governments. And we often see that as a hierarchy. But that's not really necessarily the case. The author D.O. Wright in 1988 laid out these models, and he talked about different ways of modeling the relationships between the national government, the state government, and local governments. And you can see on the left that it looks more like a hierarchy where there's the national government on top of over the state government. And you can see in that model that local government has its sphere, but it's completely subsumed by the state government. The middle model is more of a traditional hierarchy. The local government has some powers, but they are subsumed by the state government, which has some powers, but those are subsumed by the national government. But maybe it's closer to what we see on the right there, where it's a set of interlocking circles. The national government has some powers reserved to it. The state governments have powers reserved to them. The local governments have powers reserved to them. And at some point, they all interact with each other in the middle of those circles. So the point is that there is tension, and there continues to be tension between this question of what are the powers of the national government versus the powers of the state governments versus powers of local governments. That tension will probably continue into the future because there is disagreement about the answers to those questions. So that's one set of tensions in terms of structure. The other set of tensions is just in the way we constitutionally structure our government. At the national level, our Constitution does lay out, three branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And we think of them as co-equals with what we call checks and balances on each other. And so that's why you see these arrows pointing each way. So we know that the legislative writes the laws, and theoretically the executive carries them out. We know that the judicial can declare a law unconstitutional, or the judicial can rule against some action that the executive has taken. And so there are these checks and balances at the national level, but typically at the state level we've done the same thing. Most state constitutions have separation of powers between the governor and the state legislature and the state judiciary. Even at the local level, we typically have this idea of separation of powers where we may have a mayor who's in charge of the departments, but there's a city council who can overrule the mayor, or the city council actually votes on the budget submitted by the mayor and modifies that budget submitted by the mayor. But the mayor may or may not have veto power. So the question is at the bottom there, where does administration fit in? And I reference a book by John Rohr from 2002, which is a really interesting book on where public administrators fit into the constitutional scheme. And you might want to take a look at that book. So where does administration fit in? Often we think, well, all at the national levels, all administrative functions work for the president. But is that really the case? For example, think of the Federal Reserve System, and the chair, Janet Yellen, is the current chairwoman of the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve does not work for the president. The chair of the Federal Reserve is nominated by the president and approved by the Senate, but the chair of the Federal Reserve does not serve at the pleasure of the president. The president can't fire the chair of the Federal Reserve. So where do administrators really work, and who do they work for? And what about this thing we've been talking about for 3 weeks? The politics-administration dichotomy. How does that fit in to that tension there, that horizontal tension? So let's talk for the rest of this lecture really about the Constitution itself and the Federalist Papers, because it's important for us as public administration professionals to understand the foundings, I think. This isn't a class on constitutional law. I'm not a lawyer, so It's not really the point that I'm establishing myself as a lawyer, but I think it's important to understand the constitutional structure really belongs to all of us, and it's important that we understand it. So we know that the United States Constitution is really the oldest written national constitution that's still in force. So in a great many ways, it's a model for the rest of the world. We know that at the time of the creation of the Constitution, that elites in our country were divided about the need to create a stronger constitutional structure. And we know that some things led to the founding of the Constitution. There was this general perception that the government in existence under the Articles of Confederation was not strong enough. Although, again, not everyone shared that view. But there was about three basic tasks that the Constitutional Convention of 1787 attempted to accomplish. They wanted to improve relationships among the states, and that's the quote of a more perfect union. They wanted to design a federal system with limited delegated and enumerated powers of a central government and the remainder reserved to the states. And they wanted to implement the principle of government by consent. And, you know, the creation of a stronger constitution was in fact advocated by people like Madison and Hamilton, who believed that the Articles of Confederation, the current governing document, was ineffective and weak. And so there was this Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787. And so here's kind of what led up to 1787. We know that the Articles of Confederation, fully called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, that really was the charter document that governed the revolutionary United States through the Revolution and through 1789, a couple years after the Constitution was written, but before it was ratified. This Carey and McClellan book that I reference they say that in a way the Articles were really more of a treaty than a genuine constitution. You know, there was a Congress. Power was vested in Congress, but that Congress had no judicial or real executive action. For example, in taxation, it had to ask pretty much the states for taxation. It required unanimous consent for most actions. So each state of 13 had one vote, but any action required unanimous consent. Continental Army pay was a problem, and this is discussed in a book by Meyerson that I have in the bibliography. But it's a direct result of the inability of the Continental Congress to compel taxation, and so we had a lot of soldiers that hadn't been paid. But meanwhile, during this entire Confederation period, constitutional experimentation was already happening in the states. So Massachusetts actually had a constitutional convention, and the Massachusetts Convention, still in force, actually predates the United States Constitution. It's a still in force continuing document. In 1786, there was a convention in Annapolis, which only 5 states attended, but they called for a convention in 1787 to actually look at the Articles of Confederation. And so the Continental Congress itself reluctantly agreed that some kind of conference was needed to actually look at the Articles of Confederation. And so Congress said that yes, we authorize a constitutional convention with the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. And so the bottom line is that the Constitutional Convention really went far beyond what that strict wording of the Continental Congress said, revising the Articles of Confederation. In fact, they threw out the Articles of Confederation and wrote an entirely new document. But that document, of course, needed still to be ratified. And so there were really 2 big issues that came to the fore right away, among many others. But this issue was the issue of representation. In other words, how much representation does each state have? Does each state have one vote, as Madison and the Virginia plan pushed, or should we have representation by population? And so this was called the New Jersey plan. And so the great compromise that you hear about often was the creation of a House of Representatives with proportional representation, and the Senate with equal state representation. So rather than some kind of unicameral system, the bicameral system was created. One was composed of representatives based on population, and one was composed of senators based on just the number of states. And so, moving right along, and I don't want to talk about every single issue that came up in the Constitutional Convention. The point is that a constitution was written in 1787, and they handled a variety of issues. And these are the issues that became part and parcel of the Constitution, and then part and parcel of the Federalist Papers. So, national security was an issue tackled by the Constitutional Convention. That is, what's the role of some kind of national army and navy versus the role of state militias? People realized that there were state militias in 1787. What they don't also realize is that about 5 states had their own navy. Democratic versus Republican government. So again, bicameralism versus unicameralism, direct elections versus indirect elections, participation in the political process. In other words, who has the suffrage, who has the vote, factions, South versus North, slave versus free, manufacturing versus agriculture, separation of powers, the power of each branch, how members of each branch are elected or appointed, the presidency, which was kind of a brand new concept. How is this person elected? What was the power of the presidency versus Congress, and power over what? Same with the Congress. How was the Congress elected? What was the power of each house? What was the power of the Congress versus the president? And the judiciary. How was the judiciary appointed? Did it have power over the making of laws? Did it have power over the execution of laws? And so all these topics were handled within the Constitution and then by default in the Federalist Papers. So what were the Federalist Papers? Something we talk about all the time. Well, the Federalist Papers really were pamphlets, if you will, published in newspapers, and they were written primarily by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, but mostly by Madison and Hamilton. And they actually were advocacy pieces published mostly in newspapers in New York State, because at the time, New York State was holding a convention to determine if it would ratify the Constitution. So, it's important to realize that the Constitution as written was probably not going to survive if New York State and Virginia didn't ratify the Constitution. Even though it only took 9 states to ratify the Constitution, if Virginia and New York State weren't willing to go along, then it was probably going to fall apart, because those were the largest states. And so Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, who were advocates or Federalists of the Constitution, wrote a series of newspaper editorials, if you will, or pamphlets to push for ratification. And so this book by Carey and McClellan, they say that the Federalist Papers can be outlined in 4 basic parts. Part 1, they say that Hamilton and Madison and Jay advocated the advantages of a more perfect union. So in Federalist 2, we see the push that Americans are already one people, not 13 different peoples. We see an advocacy for greater national security in Federalist 3 and 4. We see an advocacy that we should avoid interstate conflicts that could lead to war in 6 and 7. we see the Constitution is an example of improved science or knowledge about politics. We see that the Constitution provides a way to avoid what Madison called factions in Federalist 10. We see that a constitution provides commercial advantages free from European influences, and we see a national tax advantages. And so all these are in the vein of a more perfect union. Part 2, according to Carey and McClellan, the Federalist Papers point out weaknesses of the existing Confederation. And you can see these here. I'm not going to read every one on this slide, but you can see these here. But primarily they said that the national government really was unable to compel compliance by states. They needed to use quotas, and that went for everything: taxation, military action. And so these were the weaknesses of the existing Confederation. Part 3, the Federalist Papers explain the Constitution, and they explain really the powers that should be exercised by the national government. So in this part, they're really talking about the difference between what the state governments should be in charge of, really, and what the national government should be in charge of. And in particular, one of the most important things they tackled was that the national government was in charge of the military. We weren't going to have 13 separate armies, even though there were militias. Command and control of the army, if you will, belonged to the national government. And that was a very important point. And that is addressed in several of the Federalist Papers. And then part 4 was why the Constitution conforms with principles of republicanism. This is very important because we know about the Federalist Papers. What most of us don't know much about are the Anti-Federalist Papers. There were editorials, pamphlets written by people who opposed ratification of the Constitution. They became known as the Anti-Federalists. But their primary argument was that this government envisioned by the Constitution was not really going to be a Republican government. And so Madison and Hamilton and Jay spend a great deal of time explaining why the Constitution really was a Republican government, and that it wasn't a step towards tyranny, as some of the Anti-Federalists said. And so those are the 4 parts according to Carey and McClellan. And please take the time as you're reading, as I'm talking, really to read the major points. Because these are very important. And you notice that I reference each one of the Federalist Papers after the major points. So, lest we forget, the Constitution, as we talk about it today, has taken on almost this sort of religious aura. And and I don't know that there's anything wrong with that. But what I would say is that, the Constitution that we have today, and when people kick around the word Constitution, the Constitution we know of today really wasn't the Constitution of 1787. For example, the House of Representatives was proportional. As I said, that was the Great Compromise. But let's not forget that the southern states actually gained more representation because they got to count 3/5 of each person who was in slavery. The word slavery is never mentioned in the Constitution. But the clause, the famous or infamous 3/5 clause, actually added more representation for southern states for people who were enslaved, even though they really only recognized slaves as property. So, that is something that people don't talk about being in the Constitution very much. The Constitution of 1787 called for a Senate elected indirectly by state legislatures. There was no such thing as a voter voting for a senator, a U.S. senator. They were all elected by state legislatures. And so actually the Senate represented the states. The Senate didn't represent the people. The president was elected indirectly by electors, elected by voters or the state legislatures. Well, we still have the Electoral College. But the fact of the matter is, for the most part, the electors in the early part of the Republic were actually elected by state legislatures. So there was an indirect election of the president. There was not a direct election of the president. The office of vice president was mentioned in Article 1 and Article 2, but the only jobs given to the vice president are president of the Senate and becoming president of the United States should the president become unable to serve. There's really no jobs mentioned for the vice president, and that role since then has really waxed and waned based on what the president wants. There was a Supreme Court and other federal judiciary appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate, but there are a few things that the Supreme Court really didn't have the role to do. The role of judicial review, as we know it now, really wasn't in the Constitution. And then further, there was no Bill of Rights yet in 1787, and the federal government still had fairly weak taxation rights, with the assumption that the states actually did most of the taxing. So this is a slide that I developed from another course, and I kind of kept it because it points out, you know, what when people think of the Constitution, certain things come to their mind, and one of the things I'm sort of familiar with is the military, and you know, in the preamble to the Constitution, it talks about the common defense. Well, what did that really mean? You know, people tend to believe that the military that we have today in 2016 was what the founders envisioned. You know, I would argue that the military we have today is not what the founders envisioned. Does that make our military unconstitutional? And I would argue that no, the answer to that question is no, our military is not unconstitutional. It's just that our military evolved within the framework of the Constitution. And so in 1787, what did Hamilton and Madison think of the military in the Constitution and in the Federalist Papers? In 1787 in the Constitution, we see that there's a separate national army and a separate national navy, each of which has a separate chain of command that report to the president in time of war, but are separately administered by the Congress, if you will. And so they're co-equal. So there is a real reason actually for having a separate navy and a separate army, because they had different roles. So there really wasn't this idea that we should have a unified military structure necessarily, except at the office of the president. State militias existed with call-up provisions. The bulk of the army, the vision for a national fighting force was that it would be a very small professional army, and most of the soldiers would come from state militias. There was a very strong fear of standing armies. In Federalist 11, Hamilton talks about the Navy protecting national commerce. In Federalist 22, 23, 26, 27, 41, 46, we see there's a separation between provisioning, which comes from the Congress, and command, which comes from the president. There's actually even talk, Madison wrote in Federalist 28 and 74, that the National Army is really a better idea than 13 different state armies. But he actually talked about the fact that a rogue president, for example, could use the National Army to try to impose tyranny, but in that case the states could actually fight against the National Army. And then in Federalist 69, there's an emphasis on the limits of the presidential role in terms of the military. Well, post-1947, 1947, there's a very important act was written called the National Security Act of 1947, but not without controversy, because what that act really did was centralize the military into one Department of Defense. And since that time, it's actually become more centralized through other acts. But this really changed the relationship between the military and the United States. So it did things like it invented congressional control of a larger budget. It enhanced the powers of the president in the commander-in-chief role. And it maintained a civilian control of the military, but it really gave the president, again, a lot more power over the military. So the point of this slide, and I don't go into a lot of detail here, but the point of this slide is that, the military envisioned by the founders is not the military we have today, but, that doesn't make it unconstitutional. So you can find this example in a lot of other areas as well. And if nothing else, it's a lot of fodder for continued argumentation between people, and that's always fun. So what do I want you to do in week 4? Week 4, first thing, don't forget your term project proposal is due September 17th, so please do get that in. For this week, the readings in the box text include Federalist number 10, number 17, and number 51. So what I want you to do for this week's discussion, and this is, again, a post question and respond kind of discussion, I want you to take one of those, and then I want you to tell us all what you think the author's 3 main points are and be expansive about that. Then I want you to talk about 2 implications for public administration. And then finally, the 3rd point, which I was kind of talking about with that slide on the military, is what do you think the author could not have foreseen in 1787 and 1788 that would have caused a rewrite of the particular Federalist paper in 2016? So that is our discussion for this week. These are the references I was referring to. These are very useful references, so please feel free to use those in your projects or any other purposes as you go along. And as always, please do get back with me with your questions, particularly this week as you're finalizing your proposals. Thanks very much.